Hello everyone. In this lecture, I want to focus on the research process for gathering sources to use in your incident analysis report. Unlike other research reports you might have written, the range of sources you are permitted to use for this project will be much broader and can include everything from other technical reports and white papers to newspapers, blogs, documentaries, journal articles, social media posts, infographics, magazine articles, and a lot more. Not only is it okay to use non-traditional sources like blog posts or tweets, depending on your topic, this might actually produce the most reliable and relevant sources of information about your incident. The critical point is that you need to be prepared to defend your choices and explain why a particular source deserves to be cited. Not just what information you could get from it, but why that source meets your criteria for credible, unbiased, and interesting research. In the remainder of this lecture, I will focus on 4 strategies that will help you get the most out of your research this week. In addition, I will reference a document I added to Blackboard titled Incident Analysis Example, which walks through a topic I chose back in August 2015 to illustrate the research process for this project. I also strongly suggest looking at the sample projects that I have added to Blackboard from students in previous semesters. So if you go to Unit 3, click on Incident Analysis Example, you'll see this document. What I've added basically walks through the process that I took to research the Gold King mine disaster that happened in Colorado back in August 2015. My first suggestion, which you'll see I talk about here, is to begin your research process as broad as possible, but quickly narrow your focus based on what you found in initial sources. Looking at my example, you can see that I began my research into the Gold King mine disaster by looking at Google News and Wikipedia, both of which pointed me towards other sources and helped me understand my topic better. I didn't know much about it, so these were great initial places to get information. It's important to note that I didn't stop here, and if I'd written a full report, I wouldn't have cited Wikipedia, and I wouldn't have cited the Chicago Tribune. Why? It's because they are part of the critical early stage of research, where I am more concerned with learning and asking questions than with finding things that I will actually cite. I know that seems counterintuitive, but not all sources that are useful are actually useful in the final report. Some just give you information that lead to more interesting sources, which I'll describe in a second. As I see it, research often occurs in roughly 3 stages, which I've illustrated for you in this series of arrows. Pre-search, narrowing sources or narrowing research, and then final sources. I'll describe each of those. First, pre-search is kind of a dumb title, but it helpfully describes the earliest stage of the process, when you aren't quite sure of your topic or focus, and find sources that simply help you decide what you want to actually research. Typically, these sources aren't directly referenced in your final project, but rather give you the gist and point you to better sources. In my example, I actually began with a Chicago Tribune article called Yellow Sludge Spilled into River. This is about as broad and generic as you can get. It's meant for an extremely broad general audience, and it really doesn't include that many details. It basically provides a summary of the topic for somebody who just maybe wants to know what happened, but doesn't really tell you much other than the basic information. Moving from there, you then get to narrowing research. Narrowing research begins once you have a topic and know the general information that you gleaned from pre-search, and then begin the process of moving away towards more specialized information that was created by experts, including primary sources by those with first-hand experience. As the name implies, narrowing sources help you narrow towards useful information, decide what is most important or most relevant, and cut out anything that doesn't meet these criteria. While narrowing sources can be cited, they often point towards other information that is more useful. For my research on the Gold King mine disaster, for instance, I went from the Chicago Tribune to a Denver Post article. This Denver Post article referenced an EPA report and referenced the Animas River stakeholder group and several other sources that are more interesting and more specific than the Denver Post article. So if I wanted to talk about the Denver Post article and talk about some aspects that includes, I might, but I also might just go to the sources that this article references. That's a similar role that Wikipedia plays. Well, Wikipedia is very useful. More useful is the sources that they cite, which you can then go and read yourself. This EPA report became a key piece of, if I actually wrote the report, became a key piece of that argument, whereas the Denver Post article may have just been supporting information. Narrowing sources also offer you key terms. In my case, Animas River became something more specific that gave me more information about that environment. It also narrows your ideas. So if I were to actually develop this into an incident analysis report, I would focus on the long-term impact of mining in the Animas River beyond just the Gold King mine. That was one environmental catastrophe, but there were others that don't necessarily get brought up. Each of these points led to another deeper and more specific round of research that I simply would not have gotten to unless I had narrowed. And that leads to the final category of research, final sources. Final sources are what you actually cite in your final report. They're specialized and present a perspective or angle that is not available anywhere else. Most importantly, these sources have been evaluated and determined to be credible, useful, and interesting. You go through pre-search and you go through narrowing sources in order to find a handful of final sources that are essentially the most important or the most valuable information you found during your research. It takes a lot of sources to get there, though, and that's why these first two arrows are kind of nestled together. You need to do pre-search and you need to do narrowing in order to get to the final sources. Yes, it would be nice if you just found these final sources right off the bat, but that's not really how research happens. You don't know what you're looking for until you find it. With my Gold King mine research, the final sources that I simply would not have found without considerable legwork were the Bureau of Reclamation's technical report, the Animas River Stakeholder Group website, and then the York Water Colorado blog. All of these allowed me to focus on highly specific information that did not show up in my initial Google News source, that were not referenced in general articles from the Chicago Tribune or the Denver Post, and that I simply would not have found unless I put in a lot of extra work going through Google search results, doing specific searches on pages like the Animas River Stakeholder Group, and things like that. Again, this takes time. It's not easy, but finding these kinds of sources is worth the effort. And it's essentially what you're looking for, is these specific and refined pieces of information. So thinking about research as these three interlocking steps allows you to see that you can't just move from pre-search to final sources without first finding sources that help you get more specialized and more detailed. It's not always a perfect linear process. You might find final sources and then go back to narrowing and look for more. But this image of three interlocking arrows shows the importance of doing all three stages. The next suggestion I have is to get in the habit of evaluating sources before using them, rather than using everything you find. Simply put, not everything you find should be cited. And when you include a source in your research, you aren't simply using the information it contains. You are also making a statement about the credibility, veracity, and relevance of its contents. You don't always have to agree with your sources, and it's certainly possible to reference something and be critical of it. However, if you hold a source up as evidence, then you are also vouching for its credibility and connecting your professional ethos to that of the authors. If you have any reservations about the source, where it came from, what it contains, who created it, when it was published, how it's been received by others, then you should perform a cost-benefit analysis and decide what value it provides. An example from my research of a source that I evaluated is the article on the Animas River Stakeholder Group from the Your Colorado River blog. This blog, upon first look, doesn't seem like much. It's highly specific, it's not well known, it's not a national source by any means, but it also has a clear anti-mining bias. However, I chose to use it because it offers a perspective absent in any of the other documents that I used, particularly the EPA and Bureau of Reclamation reports, which barely mention the community that was impacted by the release of wastewater into this river. This article talks about that community in a way that I simply did not find anywhere else. If someone challenged my choice, if they asked me, why did you include Your Colorado Water blog rather than CNN or the Chicago Tribune article, I would be prepared to explain why I believe this source is credible and why it provides a different perspective and a different viewpoint that I did not find anywhere else. My third suggestion is to find contrasting views. I know this can be a little counterintuitive, but sometimes it's best to seek out views that disagree with either your own opinions or disagree with each other, particularly when dealing with a topic that has led to clearly established political positions or factions, or that might lead to biased information. If you include only sources from one side of a controversial issue that has multiple sides, you can be accused of perpetuating the biases of those sources. If you contrast multiple perspectives in different sources, however, you both avoid the pitfall of bias and allow your analysis to focus on why and how different viewpoints developed. For example, many of the national sources I found blame the EPA for the Gold King mine disaster. But many sources sees it as a political opportunity to critique the EPA, or they make the Gold King mine disaster sound like an isolated incident that could have easily been prevented. The blog post from the High Country News called When Our River Turned Orange argues that this particular spill was bad, but it's only the latest environmental catastrophe in the area, and really just a symptom of a much larger and more complex problem related to the mining industry and the history of mining in that area. The two viewpoints are contrasting, and while each might have their own biases, by analyzing both, I avoid simply repeating their arguments and instead create a more contoured and subtle analysis. My fourth suggestion is to record and cite everything. The example that I gave you of all these different sources, this is actually how I would organize my information. It allows me to see where this information is coming from, and in a single page, I have everything that I've used. I might then add my own notes or annotations. I might organize them. Here I organized it by secondary and primary sources. You might organize it by theme or subtopics. You might develop your citations as you go, so you don't lose anything. You might take notes to remind you why you chose a source. You may have found a source but then later forget why it was so important. Taking notes lets you remember that. You might maintain a document with every source, as I did here, so that you can easily find things and not lose anything. Or you might keep a running list of keywords or search terms that you used to narrow your focus. That way you remind yourself, oh yeah, I went from Gold King mine disaster to Animas River pollution to mine blowout. And each of those terms allowed me to get more specific. I want to conclude this lecture with some suggestions about conducting research collaboratively. If you go back to Blackboard, you'll notice that I added a collaboration guide. Well, I won't read this whole thing. I will point out that there are differences between what I call cooperative writing and collaborative writing. Cooperative writing is where everyone works on separate parts, and then at the end, either one person or the group kind of edits them all together. Collaborative writing is when everyone begins with one part and then trades so that no one person is responsible for an entire section of the document. So rather than person 1 doing the intro, person 2 doing the body, and person 3 doing the conclusion, person 1 might write the intro, but edit the conclusion. And person 2 might write the body, but then revise and proofread or rewrite the conclusion. That way, every single person in the group sees every aspect of the document. This is truly collaborative because it prevents you from saying, well, this was person 1's part of the document. Or that was so-and-so's job, not my job. You are all responsible for the entire report. Your name is on the entire report. And it's easiest if you don't actually revise or rewrite or edit the same sections that you wrote. It gives you more distance from what you wrote. It allows you to have more of an objective viewpoint. The same thing goes when doing research. You should definitely not have one person whose job it is to find all your sources. That just doesn't make sense. Instead, you should each be kind of looking for different kinds of information. You might have one person do research on the Environmental Protection Agency, again, to use my example. You might have another person do research on the citizens. You might have one person look at social media while other people look at technical reports. There's different ways of breaking it down, but again, you should all be reading the kinds of research that everyone else finds. Don't put yourself in a position where one person is doing everything. Let's say that person stops communicating with you, or drops the course, or gets sick, or gets in a car accident. You want to make sure that everyone has access to and has read all of your research. While it might be more work, the finished product will be far more cohesive and consistent, and as a result, you'll have stronger communication, better cross-collaboration, and more careful balancing of responsibilities. That isn't everything that's in this guideline. I strongly recommend carefully reading through this collaboration guide this week before you really get into writing. That way you can see some of my tips and suggestions for making sure that you are not doing things that are maybe more efficient or more that more effectively use time at the expense of doing something that is higher quality. That's it for now. For now, good luck with your research.